Here's some silly questions that were posed to Richard Dawkins and Cardinal George Pell, who at the time was the Archbishop of Sydney, but is now at the Vatican, where it's easier to avoid the authorities who are investigating Australian Catholic institutions.
At Easter, Australia's religious leaders invoke the name of God in order to preach peace, tolerance, political integrity, social and moral fortitude. All obviously positive and worthwhile values. My question is, in what way is the practice of these values dependent on an existing God? Is it possible for an atheist to be a peace-loving, socially responsible person?
Why not? Are religious people only peace-loving because their God commands them to be? Is there nothing about peace that someone could find lovable without being commanded to love it under the threat of eternal torment? If Christians discovered that there is no God, would they be like, fuck this peace bullshit, I don't like it anymore. I would much prefer to live under the constant threat of violence.
And it's interesting to look at pagan Rome before there was Christian influence. 40% were slaves. Men and women fought one another to the death in the Circus Maximus or the Colosseum. Women had no rights whatsoever.
And as soon as Constantine converted, he committed to changing all that, right? He tried to abolish slavery and give women rights? No, slaves and women continued to have no rights for over 1,000 years? Well, then it's a bit of a stretch to give Christianity the credit when those things finally were granted, don't you think? There's absolutely nothing in the Bible that commands the abolition of slavery, and most of the prescriptions regarding marriage treat women like they're property.
We're Christians. We're New Testament people. There was an evolution in the Old Testament. There are some awful things there. It developed. The notion of God was purified as it went through the Old Testament.
So the God of the Old Testament was an impure God? Or did the perfect and infallible scriptures of that book give an impure account of that God?
Richard, if you believe the human drive to seek the truth and to constantly improve ourselves is merely a mechanism for survival, then what's the point and why should I bother?
Many apologists and theologians explain that Yahweh created human beings for the purpose of glorifying him. What the fuck is the point of that? How does that give your life any more value?
Without religion, where is the basis of our values? And in time, will we perhaps revert back to Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest?
Survival of the fittest is not a prescription. It's a common misunderstanding that this idea justifies doing away with compassion and empathy for the weak. The human capacity for empathy is an evolutionary development. We can experience empathy because this ability helps us survive and reproduce. It is part of what has made us and our ancestors the fittest.
But to live our lives in a Darwinian way, to make a society a Darwinian society, that would be a very unpleasant sort of society in which to live. It would be a sort of Thatcherite society.
I don't agree with Dawkins here, because it could be the case that the society which is most prosperous and durable is one in which everyone is well taken care of. We wouldn't have enough empathy to even want to care for each other if it didn't confer a net advantage, or if it weren't at least neutral with regard to our survival and reproduction. A society that abandons the weak, like the Spartans did, is not likely, and certainly not necessarily, the most fit society in an evolutionary sense.
It's part of being human to ask why we exist. Questioning distinguishes us from the animals. It's to ask why we're here. So, I repeat, and this is a commonplace in science, science has nothing to say about that. As whatever it might say about mountains, it can't say what is the purpose of human life.
Pell assumes that there is a purpose to human life, and he defends this assumption by implying that seeking for some purpose that we have no good reason to believe is even there is inherent to being human. And saying that this is what distinguishes us from other animals also implies that to not make this a rational assumption is to render oneself less than human.
And it's not Maggie Thatcher who was in the epitome or the personification of social Darwinism. It's Hitler. And Stalin.
Hitler was a Catholic, like Pell, and Stalin rejected Darwinism in favor of Lysenkoism because the Soviets felt that Darwinism was inconsistent with their ideology. Specifically, they rejected the principle of natural selection, the principle upon which social Darwinism is based, in favor of what they called natural cooperation. Pell has it precisely backwards. Stalinism was not the epitome of social Darwinism, it was the diametric opposite of it.
I have
because
said...
it's the struggle for survival. The strong take what they can and the weak give what they must, and there's nothing to restrain them. And we've seen that in the two great atheist movements of the last century.
On what fucking planet was Nazism atheist? Apologists often like to claim that Hitler was not a true Scotsman, I mean Christian, but there is no basis on which to claim that he was an atheist. But even if he were an atheist, the vast majority of the members of the Nazi Party were practicing Christians of one kind or another. To interpret Nazism as an atheist movement would require the kind of hermeneutic contortionism of which only apologists seem to be capable.